Hello, my name is Brooklyn Gosnell, and today I will be discussing suicide and mental illness amongst minority adolescents living in poverty. It is no doubt that poverty in the United States exists today, as it has in the past, and still seeks out answers to what the solution may be. In 2011, childhood poverty reached record high levels with an estimated 16.7 million children living in food-insecure households, a reported 35% more than what was estimated in 2007. A 2013 UNICEF report has ranked the U.S. as having the second highest adolescent poverty rates in the developed world. In 2016, a study done by the Urban Institute stated that teenagers living in these low-income communities are often pressured into joining gangs, selling drugs, or exchanging sexual favors because they simply cannot afford food. But what does this mean for the mental health of these adolescents? Studies have shown that poverty does not only affect one's physical well-being, but it also drastically affects one's mental well-being. Moreover, for adolescents who are minorities and also live in poverty, the likelihood of developing a mental illness or of committing suicide increases even more so. Studying minority adolescents who live in poverty and how mental illnesses affect these individuals proves important not only because we as a society need to focus on the nationwide issue of poverty, but an increased focus on mental health is much needed as well. Poverty is linked to more than just starvation and homelessness, but it has been proven that poverty has a direct link to an increase in the number of suicides and mental health diagnoses within the minorities. While mental health awareness has been increasing within the past decade or so, there is only so much outreach that has been extended to minority adolescents, especially to minority adolescents living in poverty. Phone lines, online chats, and other suicide prevention outreach efforts that take place via some sort of electronic device may help those who have access to those devices, but does nothing for adolescents living without a home computer or without a mobile device. Moreover, minority adolescents living in communities where the poverty level is high most likely also have a much more difficult time finding help at school for their mental health issues as well. Chances are, these school districts with a high poverty rate have less funding to be funneled into mental health resources and therefore leave their students with less outlets and less help when it comes to mental illness. So, what does research even start to say about minority adolescents living in poverty and these adolescents' state of mental unwellness? Well, one article written by Morelli and Oibad writes on how poverty, as described by the World Health Organization, is the greatest cause of suffering on earth. Not only does their article address the direct and indirect effects of relative poverty on the development of emotional, behavioral, and psychiatric problems of adolescents, but it does so in the context of the growing inequality between the rich and the poor. Within the article, the authors write that it has been known for a long time that the lowest income groups are more likely to suffer negative effects of risky health behaviors than their less poor counterparts. Within a 1995 survey published by the Office of Population, Census and Surveys, the prevalence of mental illness and the risk of suicide was consistently shown to be more common among people in lower social classes and among those living in poverty. Moreover, unemployment significantly increased the odds of mental illness and psychiatric disorders as compared to the reference group provided. Since the unemployment rate has been recorded the highest among American Indians and of Alaskan Natives, with blacks following a close second, it can be concluded that among those living in poverty, racial minorities such as American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and blacks have been hit hardest with mental illness diagnosis. Moreover, with a higher unemployment rate, the odds of a depressive or anxiety disorder were doubled among those living in poverty, especially among adolescents. 3 other researchers wrote in the Online Journal of Issues in Nursing that among adolescents from various ethnic and racial backgrounds, American Indians and Alaskan Native children were the most at risk for suicide in the United States. Risk factors for suicide among these 2 ethnic minorities stem from not only higher poverty rates, but also from limited access to health care, which can also stem from lower income rates in areas heavily prevalent with American Indians and Alaskan Native children residing. To help advocate for essential and more comprehensive mental health services to adolescents among these 2 minority groups, Gary, Baker, and Gramboy suggest services such as direct clinical care, advocacy for more culturally appropriate mental health care, and integrating the essential components of these minorities' culture and traditions into all aspects of prevention and treatment. By doing so, higher quality and more cost-effective services are able to be made through collaboration and community-based groups. The research done by Gary, Baker, and Gramboy was performed through surveys that were specifically tailored to and addressed the needs of American Indian and Alaskan Native children and adolescents. However, while their studies show results addressing only 2 minority groups living in poverty and facing the outcomes of poor mental health services, the results can be brought in to understand the mental illness and suicide-related issues that many other minority groups face while living in poverty. My last and most recently published article, The Effects of Poverty on the Mental, Emotional, and Behavioral Health of Children and Youth, considers the implications for prevention science of recent advances in research on family poverty and the effects it has on children and adolescents. By viewing data collected from the National Center for Children in Poverty, as well as from the U.S. database websites that gather statistics based on surveys and consensuses, Yoshikawa, Aber, and Bearsley were able to conclude that the best way to creating effective preventative interventions for those living in poverty, especially minorities living in poverty who are hit hardest by mental illness, was to understand the mechanisms of effect by which poverty impacts children's mental and emotional well-being. Now we are going to transition the conversation from academic journals to media articles. Reporter Peyton Lewis wrote in early July of this year the statistics showing that Georgia is the leading state for suicides among Black youth. The study showed that approximately 6 out of 100,000 African American teens from Georgia committed suicide. Lewis notes that there are many reasons for why this may be. However, they note that there are over 751,000 Black Georgians living below the poverty line, making the risk of suicide much higher for these individuals living below the poverty line, as it proves much more difficult for these people to have access to proper mental health care. While Lewis only focuses on one study from Bell State University in Indiana, the websites 11 Alive, Psychology Today, Good Therapy, and Data USA all present data that displays how the risk of suicide as well as the increase of mental health disorders are much higher for the minority adolescents as opposed to white adolescents. However, this article does not discredit how white adolescents are also affected by mental illness, although the article shows that these minority adolescents are affected not only by their ethnic and race differences, but are also affected by the likelihood that these individuals are living below the poverty line as well. Stacey M. Brown, Newswire correspondent, also writes on how Black and African American adolescents are heavily affected by not only the higher rates of suicide and mental illness, but are also directly affected by the strong stigma around the need for mental health resources and assistance. Historically speaking, seeking out therapy for one's mental health has heavily been stigmatized and made difficult for African Americans, among other ethnic minority communities. One analysis that Brown references is done by Dr. Viola Drancoli, a licensed clinical psychologist, who states that instead of finding healing and coming together, a client seeking out psychotherapy is often separated and sat one-on-one in a session with a professional. This concept can be perceived as threatening, especially as a minority who has faced a long history of being oppressed. Brown also states the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health says poverty level affects mental health status and African Americans living below the poverty level, as compared to those over twice the poverty level, are 3 times more likely to report psychological distress. Furthermore, African Americans are 10% more likely to report having serious psychological distress than whites, and the death rate from suicide for African Americans men was more than 4 times greater than for African American women in 2014. Another report by the U.S. Surgeon General found that suicide rate among African Americans was over double compared to that of whites. Yet despite the more widespread conversation regarding mental health, African Americans still refrain from seeking help. Yet, Blacks are not the only minority that face the effects of poverty and suffer from mental illness and higher rates of suicide. Rather, minorities of all different ethnic backgrounds, especially adolescents, struggle with finding the help they need when it comes to issues regarding mental health. Adolescents face not only the struggles that come with being a minority living in poverty, but they also face issues that minorities nationwide face regardless of ethnic group or race. These adolescents living below poverty line face issues regarding their own sexual preferences, peer pressure, and school-based work that also affect their mental health, therefore increasing an adolescent's risk of suicide and development of a mental disorder. Lastly, an article by Scott Scanlon writes in February of 2019 of one organization set in place to help people of color suffering from mental illness. Since many adolescents living in poverty have limited resource to mental health aids and programs, a few individuals have come together to make a program named Color Me Healthy that helps to reach out to adolescents struggling with their own mental health. Due to the increased risk of suicide and mental disorders amongst people of color, this organization is specifically set in place in a more poverty-ridden area of New York that helps to raise awareness, offer healthy outlets, and generate support for those struggling with their own mental well-being. While Vijaya and Oibad and Yoshikawa, Aber, and Beardsley spend much of their academic research finding out the cause and effect mental and emotional health has on children and youth living in poverty, media articles from Gary, Baker, and Gransbois, as well as media articles by Scanlon, Lewis, and Brown, focus in more on how mental health affects minorities, especially minorities who statistically live more in poverty than other groups. While the academic journals presented also display more quantitative data, the media articles presented display more qualitative data, with real people talking about their struggles with mental illness and suicidal thoughts. Moreover, both types of sources present information that is both accurate. However, the academic journals display more comprehensive data that has studied and covers many more people than the media articles are able to cover. While the media articles make some generalizations about ethnic minorities and their struggles with poverty and mental illness, the academic journals presented are able to state more numerical data and statistics to back their information presented, giving the academic scholars a better conclusion on how poverty affects minority children's mental health. Finally, the academic journals focus more on some of the least represented groups in the media, such as American Indians and Native Alaskans, whereas the media articles presented address more so the mental health issues regarding blacks living in poverty. While all of those living in poverty are directly affected and are emotionally burdened by their circumstances, it is without a doubt that minority children face a higher rate of depression, anxiety, suicide, amongst other mental health issues. However, I believe it is unfair to conclude that these minority children face higher rates of mental illness and suicide simply because they are minorities. Based off of other information we have discussed throughout this course, for example, family dynamics, there are certainly other ways that being an adolescent who is part of an ethnic minority may face other reasons for experiencing an increased rate of mental unwell-being. Therefore, as referenced, not only does poverty directly affect the rates of mental illness and suicide amongst minority children and adolescents, but other factors play a role as well to increase the likelihood of these emotional-based issues. Using your own psychological imagination, what are some other factors that may increase a minority youth's risk of mental illness and suicide?